I'm Lowell Liebermann, and this is Living the Classical Life.
So we'll remember.
We should take a little pause because this will take.
The dogs will calm down, yes.
William, come in and say hello.
Hello. Yeah, here we are. So, Mr. Liebermann, we're so happy to have you here on Living the Classical Life. You're a composer, you're a conductor, you're a pianist, you're a teacher, and we're so thrilled to get you here in New York City, in your home. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So take me back to the beginning. How did you first come to music? Did you come from a musical family, in fact?
I wouldn't say it was necessarily a musical family, but they appreciated music. And my mother is German, so I think she had that kind of Teutonic sense that music should be part of one's education. So my brother and I were forced to take piano lessons beginning at an early age. And I absolutely hated those piano lessons because they were with a woman who lived 2 houses down, and she wasn't a terribly good piano teacher. And she had very bad breath, and she'd sing in my face while I was trying to play the piano. So I dreaded these lessons. And I remember actually that the music we did were these horrible, horrible pieces, this John W. Schaum piano course and these stupid exercises called A Dozen a Day with little stick figures.
I played those, the stick figures, yes.
And as a child, I recognized that this was bad music, that it was condescending, awful music. And I used to cry asking her to be able to play real music. And what I meant by real music at that age was, you know, the Bach Anna Magdalena notebook or Schumann album for the young. So I really did not like those earliest piano lessons at all. But then I graduated from the woman who lived 2 doors down to the little old lady who lived across the street. And she had actually been a concert pianist at the turn of the century. Her name was Aida Sone, and knew Paderewski and knew Leczetitsky and even dated George Gershwin a couple of times and knew Joseph Hoffman. And she was this little tiny, tiny woman. She kind of looked like Yoda with big arthritically swollen fingers. And she would sit down in her apartment at her, Steinway Baby Grand and launch into the Tausig transcription of the Bach Toccata and Fugue in D minor. And I was transfixed. It was really that made me fall in love with music. And I would go for what was supposed to be a half-hour lesson, and I would stay there for, 4 or 5 hours.
Then what brought you to composition?
Even when I started piano lessons, I kind of spontaneously tried to compose, to make up pieces. And I couldn't read music yet. I didn't quite know how to read music, so I'd guess at where I should put the dots on the paper. And I remember finding some of these early attempts later on, and I couldn't decipher them, because the dots were just all over the place. I kind of always made up pieces, but when I was 13, for some reason, and I still don't quite understand, or maybe I just don't remember why, I suddenly declared that I wanted to be a composer, that I was sure that this was what I wanted to do. And that actually coincided with my family's moving from Forest Hills to Westchester, so we started looking for a composition teacher for me, which was going to be my first composition teacher. And we found Ruth Schonthal, who was a pianist, composer. She had been a child prodigy, studied with Paul Hindemith. And so she was my first composition teacher, and it was with her that I wrote my Piano Sonata No. 1, Opus 1. at the age of 15.
And then you played that at Carnegie Hall.
And then Carnegie Recital Hall, I played it, I think, a year later. But that piece actually stayed in my catalog as my first composition, and everything after that has remained in my catalog and is published and recorded and whatnot. And so I really date myself as being a composer from then, from when I was about 15.
Do you also consider that that was the first work in which your compositional voice was recognizable?
I think it's sometimes more difficult for the composer to recognize what constitutes his voice than for other people. Because as a composer, I think you're very aware of certain influences and maybe less aware of other influences. And people have told me, since I was a student actually, that I had a recognizable style that I couldn't necessarily put my finger on myself. As far as that goes, all I know is I know one way of writing music, which is the way I write music. And it's interesting because as a teacher, one of the most frequent questions I get asked from my students is, how do I find my voice? How do I create my style? And I don't think it's something you can consciously do. I think that's formed by your own taste, by what you like, what you reject, and you take all of these influences and kind of digest them, and what comes out is your style. Nowadays I find myself being influenced by music that I don't even necessarily think of as especially liking or being a big influence. But everything you hear after a certain point, I think influences you either positively or negatively.
So the style that you started out composing in, was this a conscious choice, or was this determined by your teachers, or in fact by the different influences or inspirations that you had?
I think it was more determined by just the music I heard at an early age and liked and imitated. And my first big love was actually the music of Bach. And I knew the music of Bach first through Switched on Bach done on the synthesizer by Walter Carlos, which my mother listened to incessantly. And it was the big hit back then. And so I first heard Bach's music through Walter Carlos and absolutely loved it. And then, of course, got to know the performances on the real instruments and things. So Bach was a very big early influence, and my first attempts at composition were very contrapuntal and kind of Bach-inspired, and the love of counterpoint and kind of contrapuntal invention was something that's never left me.
So instrumentalists have to practice their instrument basically every day. Does a composer also have to practice his or her craft regularly?
I don't think it's that an immediate necessity as with an instrumentalist, because of course with an instrumentalist you're dealing with muscle memory and it's like an athlete. With a composer it's a longer process. I think it's a longer process writing a piece, or at least it can be, than learning a piece necessarily. And I find that I compose best when there's a deadline looming. A lot of composers say the same thing. In fact, this past year has been a very unusual year for me in that I've had to compose almost every day because I've been working on this full-length ballet for the Royal Opera, 2.5 hours of music. So that's a situation where I really do have to compose every day, which is not the norm. Because normally the progress of a piece is you'll have a certain amount of time to write it. You'll spend a lot of time thinking about it, maybe sketching, and then as it gets closer to the deadline, the pressure is on, and all of a sudden that's a wonderful grease for inspiration.
What's the daily work process like?
It's different for different pieces. I would love if I could stick to a structured life, but other aspects of life that intrude often make that very difficult. I've always envied the way, I believe it was Thackeray supposedly worked, which he had a quota of X amount of pages every day he would write, and it was some enormous amount, like 30 or 40 pages. And if he finished a novel and had only written 28 pages, then he'd write the next 18 pages of the next novel. That kind of discipline I don't have. So it's different for different pieces, and some pieces kind of spontaneously take over and complete themselves quickly. Other pieces are a real effort where you really feel you're wrestling with the material and building the piece note by note, and that's absolutely no indication either way of how the piece will seem when it's finished, because sometimes the most difficult pieces, sometimes the pieces that have the most tortured birth, sound like the most spontaneous, easy pieces. So,
Does a composer only write when inspired or commissioned?
Well, I can only speak for myself, and I have spent most of my career living as a composer, so living off of my commissions, which means that in order to do that, I would have to be composing full-time on commissions in order to make enough of a living, which means that I did not have time to write pieces just because I wanted to. And the truth of the matter is, my composing schedule is so tight, and has been so, ongoing all these years, that when I'm not composing, when I don't have a piece to write, the last thing I want to do is write another piece. I mean, I love composing, I love doing what I do, but after a point, it is work in a certain way, and when you're not doing that work, you need, as a human being, you need to take a rest from it. You need variety in your life. And, there are lots of other things I'm interested in. Before I became hooked on music as a kid, I wanted to be an artist, and I think I was more naturally talented in a way as a painter. I was offered scholarships as a very young kid to art schools and stuff like that, which we didn't follow up on. But it was almost a situation where I could draw very easily as a kid. It came very naturally. And the music, because it was more difficult and more of a mystery, somehow captured me more. So, there are a lot of things I'm interested in. I kind of always regret that I don't have enough time to, just sit down and spend a whole day reading a book I'd like to read or something. But
do you draw inspiration from non-musical sources?
I draw inspiration as a person from non-musical sources, but I don't usually draw inspiration directly that relates to the music. All things are kind of an inspiration in a certain sense, but my music is really just about the notes. It's about the manipulation of the notes. It's about the emotions that the manipulation of the notes evoke, but those emotions are abstract. They're not tied to a program. I sometimes describe writing music as working with emotions the way an abstract painter works with colors. It's very funny because there's a flute magazine called, I forget, there's one called Flute Talk and one called Flute Quarterly, and I forget which one this was, but someone wrote an article that was called An Interpretative Guide to the Liebermann Flute Sonata. and they wrote a program for the piece that students were supposed to think about while playing the piece, and it was somehow supposed to help them. And it was all about an evil dwarf named Odin who was kidnapping water sprites and keeping them in a cage at the bottom of the Rhine. And I don't think about that kind of stuff when I write music. It's not about stories. It's not about nice sunsets. It's about the notes. It's about themes. It's about harmonies.
Does the compositional impulse always begin with sound, or does it also include rhythm, a concept, or a feeling?
It could be any of those or a combination of any of those. I mean, I compose in what I like to think of as an organic way, in that I like the material to be controlled and grow out of kind of a seed. And that seed is the musical material, but that seed can either be, it could be a melody, it could just be a group of notes, it could be a harmony, it could be any number of things. Each piece is different. It's different from, let's say, in the classical era when forms were kind of standardized, and there were certain accepted ways of writing music. You did certain things, and there were almost rules and things. Now, each piece one writes is, you're trying to create something new. You're trying to create something out of nothing. So, what sets a piece going can be different from piece to piece.
Do you ever suffer from compositional writer's block? Does that ever happen?
If I have lots of time to write a piece. If
Interesting.
And it's not really writer's block as much as not being satisfied with anything that I'm writing until it gets to the point where you just have to get something down on paper, and then you finally do, and you look at it and you say, well, actually that's not so bad, and if I just do that, that's actually pretty good, and so on and so forth. So the aspect of self-criticism, of being hard on your material and what you write, is a good thing for a composer to have, but it can also be a bad thing. I mean, you have to keep it under control and know just how far to go with it.
One of the things I like to talk about on this show is letting musicians know how to make a transition from being a student into a professional musician. Mm-hmm. How does a young composer make a living?
In this day and age, that's a question I really don't know the answer to, and things are changing. A lot of students are getting very creative in how they're, establishing their careers and how their careers are taking form. When I started out, my first composition teacher, Ruth Schoenthal, said to me, and she had this thick Viennese accent, and she said, this is a difficult life you're embarking on as a composer. You will always be unhappy. You will never get your music performed. You will have to teach or do something else to earn a living. You will resent the time you can't compose. And she said, you will only have two reasons for writing music: to have pieces for yourself to play and to seduce women. In my case, she was especially wrong on the latter point. But also, I was very stubborn and wanted to make a living writing music. And I just would not hear of doing it any other way. And I also knew that early on that I did not want to teach. I mean, the teaching for me is a very, very recent thing. But at an early age, I wasn't interested in teaching. And I found a way to make it work. And I really think it has to do with determination, that if you see, being a composer as a profession, it's not something you choose to do. And when I get a student who I sense that they've decided they want to be a composer because it's neat, because it would be a cool thing to do, I tell them to think very, very closely about that, because composition is not something you choose to do, it's something you have to do because you can't imagine doing anything else. You become a composer because it's the only thing you can do. And you know, a lot of time, it's a difficult calling in a way because you are alone most of the time that you're working. You know, it's not a group activity. And so it can be a lonely existence a lot of time. And, you know, like I'm a very gregarious person. I want to be out there with people all the time. So to get myself to kind of chain myself to the piano bench and compose takes a lot of effort.
Do you think that perhaps the solitude is necessary for the creativity, or does loneliness enhance the message of the music?
I think it's different for different people. I know that for me, the act of creating music is a very private thing. And, you know, if I'm writing a piece for a performer, I don't like talking about it to them until the piece is done. I say, you know, leave me alone until the piece is finished and then we can talk about it. But there's something very private about the act of writing, which is, I mean, it's interesting because the piece that I'm writing now, this ballet, the whole process working with a choreographer and showing them sketches before the piece is finished has been a quite new thing for me and a little bit unnerving.
Is composition something that can be taught?
No, it can't be taught, which of course sounds crazy coming from someone who's teaching composition. What can be taught is orchestration, harmony, all those kind of theory things, but hopefully a composition student will already have a certain fluency in those things. So what do you do as a composition teacher, especially today when almost anything goes, you know, in terms of style, in terms of aesthetics? What I do is try and get the students to a point where they can step back and listen to their own music as if somebody else wrote it. And again, that's about objectivity, about gaining a certain amount of objectivity and just kind of developing a sense of self-criticism in the students. And once they've achieved that, they don't need a teacher anymore.
You studied at Juilliard at a very exciting time and you had very famous teachers. What did you get from your teachers at Juilliard?
It was a crazy time. I entered Juilliard when I was, I think, 18 years old, and I believe I was the youngest person in the composition department at the time. And it was a very formidable composition department. I remember walking into the room for the audition, and there sitting was Roger Sessions and David Diamond, Vincent Persichetti, Elliott Carter, Milton Babbitt. I mean, that was quite an impressive group of things. Diamond, who I first studied with, was an absolute lunatic on many levels. He was a tremendous inspiration the first year because he had all these amazing stories about hanging out with Ravel and this person he met and you know, all kinds of people. After a while, you kind of began to get the sense that he was making up half the stories that he was telling you, and you kind of had to decide what was true and what was not true. And after quite a few years, I mean, I did my first 2 degrees with Diamond, and I really felt I needed a change. And switched from my doctorate work to Persichetti, who was just an amazing, amazing musician in terms of, I mean, he could read the most complex score as if it was a newspaper, and his musical memory was quite staggering. He was a very great man, and he could look at the piece you brought him and know exactly what you were thinking to an uncanny degree. But he also said that he wished he had me at an earlier age so that he could really get into my head and know what I was thinking, because by the time I was studying with him, he almost treated me more like a colleague than a student. He would look at the pieces and say, yeah, you know what you're doing, great. But in terms of what I learned at Juilliard, I really think that the person I learned the most from was my piano teacher, Jacob Lateiner. And they made an exception for me. They let me take a piano minor, but studying with a major faculty. They kind of made a special arrangement for me to study with Lateiner, who was a Beethoven expert and scholar. And he was the first person to really drum into me that all those dots and little carets and slurs and things were really as important as the notes themselves, because this was kind of coming out of a period when it was more common than not for the performers. The performers back then thought that the notes were sacred, but everything else was your interpretation. So you could ignore dynamics and phrasings and tempi and everything. As long as you were playing the notes, everything else was kind of up for grabs. And Lateiner, especially coming with Beethoven, where every single mark really does matter, kind of drummed in the necessity of really being clear in the notation and really writing down what you meant. And I think that thinking really informed my composition.
What's your relationship with your audiences or your listeners? When you're writing your music, are you aware of what the reaction might be?
I'm aware of that my music will be heard by an audience. Mm-hmm. Who that audience is another question. But the thing is, I've always believed that music, like every other art form, is a form of communication. And that no matter how complicated the idea the artist is communicating, it is the artist's duty to communicate that idea as clearly as possible, no matter how complex the idea is. Mm-hmm. So I've always been one for clarity and everything. But in terms of an audience, yes, I think one has to be aware that the end result is that an audience will be listening to this thing you're creating. But in my mind, the audience that I'm imagining is 2,000 of me sitting in an auditorium. And, again, going back to what I tell my students, I tell them you have to remember that, yes, you are writing your music to be listened to, but write the music that you would want to hear if you were sitting in that audience.
You've written some operas. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that opera is relevant in today's world? Is it something that is understood by audiences, or an effective way to communicate a large musical idea?
Opera is as relevant or as irrelevant as any other art form, depending on the audience and the artist and what the individual work is. There's an audience for every kind of music, and whether that audience is bigger or smaller doesn't matter.
Of all the works that you've written, is there one that's particularly close to your heart or personal in meaning?
No, because it's like, it's kind of like Sophie's Choice. Which one do you pick?
Yeah.
And the other funny thing is when you're in the middle of writing a piece, at least with me, when I'm writing a piece, it kind of obliterates the memory of every piece I've written before it. You get so intensely concentrated on that. So it's a very difficult question to ask, but, if I try and answer it, I'll say, well, they're my two operas, but then I say, okay, they're also my four symphonies, which I like, and then I think, I like my piano concertos too, and, it's just hard to choose.
I'm so curious about your perspective about a debate that's going on somewhat these days, performing from memory. You're a performer and you're a composer. Do you have thoughts one way or the other as to whether performing from memory is helpful or necessary?
Well, I've performed, but in a limited way because I've never been a soloist. I've never done recitals. I never really felt secure in terms of the memorization enough to want to do solo performing. So my performing has pretty much been limited to chamber music, where I have the music in front of me, where I feel secure with that. I think it depends on the performer. Of course, the whole performing without music was started by Liszt.
Yes.
Before that, people always performed with music. I think, it could go either way, and it depends on, well, how well does the performer know the piece. I think there are certain situations where it can be almost a little bit of arrogant bravado to not use the music. But then if you're performing a piece and you have the music there because you really need it, and don't know the piece that well, that's also not good. So I'm kind of in the middle.
What's been the most rewarding aspect of your life?
Well, the most rewarding moment is when you're there at the first performance of something and the work is done and you can just relax. Because, the pressure of always having a piece is constant. It's kind of like having a 24-hour part-time job, because you can't actually be composing physically all the time, but the pieces never leave you. They're always in your head right where you left them off, trying to complete themselves. So it's only when a piece is done that you get this kind of feeling of release. And so those moments when you finally see something brought to fruition are very satisfying, and especially when it's something like an opera or a symphony,
How important is popularity to you?
Popularity is nice, but if I was in it for popularity, I wouldn't be writing the kind of music I'm writing. It's a funny thing because, of course, popular in terms of popular music, what is popularity, what is recognition, has nothing to do with it in classical music if you compare the numbers. So in a way, I think that in terms of career, I've got the best of both worlds, because I'm well known in my field, and yet it still gives me a certain anonymity in everyday life that I don't have to worry about, being swamped by whatever.
Right.
Which must be horrible. And I mean, even kind of, third tier actors have to deal with all kinds of stalkers. And actually, I did have a stalker for a while, but that doesn't usually happen. You can go about your daily life and just be a normal human being. So,
When you wrote Gargoyles, did you expect that it would be played all around the world in basically every piano competition that exists?
No, I didn't. And of course, I'm very happy it is. But it's that Gargoyles and the Flute Sonata, actually, they both have kind of achieved comparable popularity and really achieved repertoire status, which is something that I really didn't ever think about as even being a possibility. And I think about Gargoyles now. That was my opus 29. And the last piece I finished, my fourth symphony, was my opus 129. So that's 100 pieces ago. So when I think of Gargoyles, it's like such a distant... It's almost as if I did not write it at this point. It's taken on its own life. I suppose it's like parents who have kids and they grow up, and after a certain point, the parents don't recognize them anymore. It must be kind of the same thing.
For general audiences who don't know, what's the difference between composition and songwriting? Because there are songwriters who say, I'm a composer.
Well, I remember going out to bars when I was in my 20s, and you meet people and they'd say, oh, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm a composer. And they'd say, oh, what songs did you write? What songs of yours would I know? And you'd have to explain, no, it doesn't. And then they'd say, oh, well, you're in a band then. And no, I'm not in a band. You don't play guitar? No.
Is there a single overarching message that you hope that your audience will take away from your performances of your music?
No, there isn't, because each piece is different. I think there's been a lot of hyperbole about, the arts kind of having some kind of sacred duty, and the arts' ability to change people and ennoble people and whatnot. And I think there's a lot of hogwash in that. I mean, it basically is highfalutin entertainment when you get down to it. And in a certain sense, yes, one hopes that a sensitivity to, that it sensitizes people to certain kinds of things. But history has shown us that some of the most horrible people imaginable were great connoisseurs of the arts and whatnot. So in terms of a message, no, there is no single message.
Are you optimistic about the future of classical music?
I think the more relevant question is, am I optimistic about the future of the world? No, seriously. I think there's been way too much doom and gloom about the death of classical music. These kind of, dire forecasts have occurred in every successive generation throughout history. Every 100 years, someone says, oh, this is it, it's going to be dead. I think there will always be an audience for classical music as long as people are writing it and other people are interested in listening to it. It never will be the same kind of audience that there is for certain kinds of popular music, but it never has been.
It's been a pleasure to have you here on the show. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everything that you've shared, and thank you for your works.
Well, thank you for spending the time with me.
Thank you. Awesome. It was fun. Yes.